All right. Well, without further ado, I would love to get started since we have just an hour together. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening on this historic milestone, the 30th anniversary of the passage of the ADA. My name is Mandy Levine, and on behalf of the City of Portland's Disability Advisory Committee, Disability Rights Maine, and the Maine Jewish Film Festival, thank you so much for joining us for this moderated discussion of the remarkable documentary Crip Camp. Crip Camp is about reclaiming and celebrating your identity, telling your story, and discovering the power of community. The film, which, no surprise, won Sundance's 2020 Audience Award for Best Documentary, can be used to build an understanding of disability rights and justice, foster safe conversations and healthy discussions, amplify the voices of a marginalized community, and build bridges between people who share very similar as well as very different backgrounds. Today, 1 in 4 adults in the United States have some type of disability, and Crip Camp is one of those disability community stories. There are thousands more, led and told by people with all kinds of disabilities, races, ethnicities, genders, class backgrounds, and so much more. And the issue of disability affects many of us, whether directly or indirectly. It is my extreme privilege to introduce our two renowned speakers. First, Ben Levine. As I mentioned earlier, no relation to me. Ben Levine is a filmmaker and the director of Speaking Place, which is a social catalyst organization based in Rockland, Maine, that is active in public health awareness, reviving endangered languages, and justice issues. Ben was originally trained as a clinical psychologist, where he developed the use of documentary video feedback, which we're going to be learning about shortly, with adolescents with disabilities. He's recognized as a video pioneer for his work at the People's Video Theater and Survival Arts Media. His films have been presented on American as well as European television and in many festivals. And Ben's work at Speaking Place currently includes projects with the Passamaquoddy tribe and with 10 indigenous communities in southern Mexico. Welcome, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
And Dr. Melinda Mullen worked at Camp Jened from 1970 to 1975. Initially, she was a waitress and then a counselor, and eventually Melinda was the unit head for the adult camp. A surgeon, in 1996, Melinda founded the Breast Cancer Care Program at Mercy Hospital here in Portland, Maine, and she was the medical director of that care center until her retirement in 2014. Welcome, Melinda, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to bop back and forth asking questions of the two of you. And for a few of these questions, I'd love to hear both of your perspectives. My first question is for Ben. Ben, can you help us understand how you ended up filming at Camp Jened? And for those of us like myself who are not tech savvy, can you please explain to us what video playback is and how you developed this particular medium?
Sure. Well, I can answer both sort of in the same little story. So how we got involved with Camp Jened. Well, first of all, let me say by way of feedback, of context, that at the time, I was a co-director of People's Video Theater along with Howard Gutstadt. Howard and I were a video collective with a number of other people, and we were introducing videotape, which was a new technology, and it had as part of what it could do that film couldn't, which is that you could immediately play back what you had recorded to the people you were recording, okay? So, of course, today we take that totally for granted, but at that time, that was a huge innovation, because most people thought of video as part of television, and television was for corporations that controlled the airwaves, and regular people just didn't have anything to do with television. Okay, so if I say I, I'm really talking about the collective and what the collective did, what Howard and I did. So we happened to have a chance meeting at a gas station with a van full of Jeanette campers who peered into our open van as we were getting gas and saw the equipment and said, "Hey, what's that?" And Howard explained to them that, we were making videotape with different communities, and people could use the equipment themselves. And they said, "Oh, that's for us. Come to our camp." So we did, and the results, of course, are pretty evident in the film. So we came to the camp, and automatically the response was very welcoming, and people really embraced recording, being recorded, and then especially seeing themselves back. So now let me get to the second part of your question, which has to do with feedback. What is feedback? So video feedback is a process. It's an awareness building process. Let me tell you a little story. When I was a clinical psychologist just a year and a half before, I worked at a place, and it's true, this is the name of the place. It was in Pittsburgh. It was called the Home for Crippled Children. And I was a clinical psychologist directing a program that had 80 adolescents. And when you walked into that recreational area, let's say, where all those young people were, it was just the opposite of what you saw in Jeanette in the film. It was total depression. These people, all these young people, suffered from a whole spectrum of disabilities. But they were not in, they were being evaluated, supposedly rehabilitated, whatever that means. But they all knew that they were going to be headed home, no matter how hard they tried and no matter how much they improved. So we were looking for ways to get engaged with them. And one of my coworkers was a photographer, and we had the idea to take photographs of the residents and take nice artful professional photographs and blow them up really big and put them up on the wall. So one day they all came in, and there was a whole wall of the recreation room was filled with these large prints of them. And nobody had ever done anything even remotely like this. And immediately the whole atmosphere changed. Well, the next day we came back and there was nothing on the wall. All the photographs were gone. We said, well, what happened? So we started searching. And we found that the residents had taken their own photographs off the wall and had started to exchange them with other people there. So suddenly these photographs became an object of value and a currency, an emotional currency that they were exchanging with each other. And from then on, we realized that we had tapped into something very, very powerful. So from then on, we had an 8mm camera. We started doing plays and films. And then we found one of the original, must have been the original videotape machine. It was in the speech therapy department. We started doing, playback with that. So what I'm getting at here is that when you film people in an intimate way and play it back to them in a careful way, you're creating a new kind of space. And we call this video feedback. And in that space, all kinds of things can and do happen emotionally, awareness building. And this is the same technique that we use today with Passamaquoddy Indians, with our communities in Mexico to build leadership, to build awareness about the importance of self and voice and all of these things that kind of come together in Crip Camp to make it a kind of revolutionary situation. So I hope that helps clarify what video feedback is.
Absolutely. And so what's the most remarkable out of many remarkable things you just said is that Crip Camp probably would not have happened if not for this happenstance encounter between you and Howard and the van full of campers from Camp Jeanette. That's really remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable. When you do this kind of work, you start to wonder about fate.
Yeah.
But it was a perfect union between what we had to offer and what they needed. And I think there's an argument to be made that the work we that we did with the campers really did create new leadership and a bonding that was important as they went out into their lives and attempted other things. I can talk about that later in one of your other questions.
Great. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Ben.
Thank
I
you.
love the storytelling. I love the two of you just to share stories all evening with us. So Melinda, a question for you is, how did you first learn about the employment opportunity at Camp Jened, and what was initially the most appealing to you about this particular opportunity?
Well, I have to be honest, I was 15 years old, and a good friend of mine from another summer camp had a sister that worked at Jened, and they needed waitresses, and I was going to make $10 a week, which at that time in the Catskills was real money. It was the year after Woodstock.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to be hanging out with my friends, unsupervised, making $10 a week, and I had no idea really what I was going to be walking into. And I think the first thing that really made me start thinking about it was the job interview I had with Larry Allison. You may remember in the film, the dramatic guy with a Australian hat. Larry was the assistant director at the time. And I had a personal experience from the last summer where I actually had fractured my thigh bone. I had to be in the hospital for three months in traction. I had to use crutches, there was a temporary disability. And Larry asked me, well, do you think the experience you've been through is going to help you empathize or function better at camp? And I thought about that, and I actually said, no, I don't think so, because yeah, I was in a wheelchair and I was on crutches, but I always knew I was going to put them down and get up.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I went through something, but the consciousness of having to live one's life with the challenge of a disability, particularly at that time in history, was not something that I could just relate to, because I'd broken my leg and had to use crutches for a few months. And getting to Jened really reinforced the fact that there were all kinds of different stories and ways of seeing that I had to have different tools for understanding.
And Melinda, did you have past experience with individuals with disabilities? I didn't realize that you were only 15 when you started there, but was that a community that you had spent time with prior to waitressing there?
Absolutely not. I mean, the reasons, please, I mean, I don't want nobody shine me up at all. The reason I went was it was an opportunity. It was only over the years, and obviously I stayed there for 6 summers, that the understanding of the value of the work and the engagement and what was happening in that community became something I wanted to continue to be a part of, and something which was absolutely a formative experience in my adolescence and a formative experience in my life.
Terrific. Well, I appreciate your honesty. That's a great story. So switching back to Ben, as I noted at the very beginning, today is a really historic day, the 30th anniversary of the passage of the ADA. Ben, can you please speak to how leadership for the disability rights movement arose out of certain experiences that you had both at Camp Jened and immediately after your time at Camp Jened?
Yeah, sure. Well, it does tie in a little bit with the last question about feedback. So we were, as you see in the film, there's a number of occasions when we're showing the footage back to the campers, and especially in the section on the message to parents. So message to parents was an idea that came out of our involvement with them as a result of them seeing footage that we had shot prior to that. So you can see that it starts to create, the feedback process starts to become a creative process. And as a creative process, people are seeing each other and listening to each other, and listening to each other have a slightly different voice than they normally do. It's a voice of desire. It's a voice where they're getting in touch with their feelings, and they're putting them out, and people are seeing that, oh, that's the same way I feel. And so that is touching people and amplifying that desire in the group. And some people are going to feel that more intensely, and they're going to want to act on it. And all of the, so many of the people in that message to parents scene did become leaders at one level or another, not necessarily the leader, but Judy in particular saw, Judy Human. I think everybody probably knows who Judy is. She's the person you first see her trying to get everybody to behind a lasagna dinner, and then of course the rest of the film is about her almost just amazing perseverance as a leader to get the ADA to the point where the ADA is passed. So Judy approached Howard and I later, a few months later, and asked us to make a film which came to be called the Transportation Video. And in that film, we followed a disabled Vietnam veteran trying to get to work, and a young woman on crutches trying to get into a city bus. And in both of these situations, as filmed, are horrific. They're scary. I mean, that fellow in a wheelchair going up Lexington Avenue with all the traffic coming at him is as scary as anything he might have seen or experienced in Vietnam. I mean, he could have easily been run over. So we made that film, and she expressively, when she saw it, she said, "I think we ought to play this for the City Council of New York," because they're always resisting parking privileges for the handicap, special zones for handicap parking. And they're always saying no, and let's show this to them. So we lugged all our equipment, all our TVs and everything up to the 4th floor of the City Council chambers, and we showed it to them. And this is, New York City Council, this is a pretty raucous group. It was pin drop silence, total pin drop silence when they watched this. And immediately right afterwards, they approved handicap parking for the city of New York. So that was a huge boost to Judy.
Amazing.
And it's not a story that ends up in the film, but the story that does end up in the film that's next is her shutting down the intersection with Disabled in Action. So this, I think, was one of the first, if not the first, this transportation video coming right after Jeanette, was really like the first thing that Disabled in Action did. And it was a success. And I think it bolstered their confidence as leaders to initiate new events that would push the movement forward.
What really strikes me, Ben, is that there are still 30 years later, so many barriers to individuals with disabilities navigating public transportation. And I think we've got some friends on this call from GP-COG who are addressing a lot of these barriers for folks who are trying to navigate the system. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of ongoing challenges for folks that unfortunately haven't probably come as far as we would like to.
Well, when we showed the film at Museum of Modern Art in New York, people had all kinds, in the audience had all kinds of stories about how the city and the institutions were simply doing everything they could to get around the provisions of the act, and it was still a constant battle. So,
and what happened with that film that you made with her?
The transportation video, well, it was a pretty rough video. It wasn't, something that was going to go on TV, but you do see a very short clip of it actually in the film. I don't have the minute number of it, but if you watch, you'll see a man in a wheelchair going up the street with the traffic coming at him. It's only a couple of seconds, but that's a clip from that film that we allowed Jim and Nicole to use. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So a question for both Melinda and Ben. During your time at Camp Jened, did you have a sense that you were part of something that was revolutionary, or that the campers themselves would someday be part of the disability rights movement?
Go ahead, Melinda.
Well, I would say this. Yes, I felt that there was something that I was part of that was revolutionary and extraordinary. If you remember back, there's a scene in the film where Neil Jacobson is talking about how when he was going to marry Denise, his mother said, you know, can't you find a polio? Because there's this hierarchy in the minds of people about, you know, the better, the more desirable disability and the less desirable disability. But if you look back at that camp and what was happening, the energy came from the fact that you had people not only with different kinds of physical disability, but you had the entire spectrum as well of intellectual challenge. Everybody was in the same bunk. Everybody was valued. Everybody was valued for who they were, and everybody's needs were explored. And everybody, the whole goal of the staff there was to make sure that, yes, everybody was respected and their needs were met. And it's hilarious. And if you want to say to me, and so, you know, what kind of in-service did you have for dressing people, feeding people, toileting people, bathing people? I mean, you could not do that today. You could not, nothing. You know, it was really, it was on the job training. But you know, we learned everybody was safe, but the whole notion of the value of every individual just because they were an individual was something that permeated the entire environment. And I think that really comes through in the film when you see people with all kinds of challenges and disabilities participating. And so the goal of the staff was obviously to keep everybody safe, but also to ensure that each individual had the most engaged time that they could have, given who they were, and also the notion that it wasn't up to the staff to kind of define what that was, and this whole notion of really listening and observing and learning from others. I mean, I think that ethos ended up being part of those who went out and actually formed the movement, who, you know, may have been, you know, who were indeed more intellectually capable than maybe this, you know, they're bunkmates, but the whole idea of the value of an individual wherever, you know, that people need to be met where they are and have value, is something that Jened was all about. It just permeated the entire place. So I guess that's what I would say. I would say it would have impacted the ethos of the disability rights movement in a way that would have not been the case if you know, if Neil's mother had been in charge.
Right, where those hierarchies were instilled.
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
That must have been tremendously empowering for the campers, I would think.
It was, because I mean, I lived in New York City, and over the years made friends with, I mean, I visited Nancy Rosenblum in her home before she moved out to California. One of my best friends was in one of the opening scenes, this guy, John Maslin, who had muscular dystrophy. I mean, it was also my first confrontation with, there's a disease that somebody's going to die of, and they're young, and they know that that's going to happen. And how is that person going to, in the time that he or she has, experience their best possibility in life. And at that time, you know, most of these folks were, if they weren't at camp, they were at home or they were in an institution.
I can imagine it was a really sacred place that the campers just so looked forward to each summer. Kind of a respite from the rest of the world, it seems.
Well, and one more thing I'll say that doesn't come through in the film is there were two units at camp. There was the teen camp and there was an adult camp. I mean, when you said I was unit head of adult camp, half of the camp was for adults. And you want to talk about a forgotten population. Many of these people were living in nursing homes and the 2 weeks, because teen camp was 4 weeks, adult camp was 2 weeks. But those 2 weeks were something that these folks looked forward to. It was just heaven. And I mean, when there was everybody, I mean, we had, again, people who, he's in the film, Harvey Jabovsky from Willowbrook, who was incredibly intellectually disabled. But, you know, we also had a guy named Hans who was a Holocaust survivor, a musician, a classical musician who developed multiple sclerosis. And he was also at camp. So the activities we would do, I mean, we would go to the classical concerts in Woodstock. I mean, we really worked to engage everybody at the level at which they could be engaged. But again, everybody was in the same bunk. I mean, it was diversity personified. But yeah, the adult camp doesn't get into the film.
Were any of the folks that were campers, were any of them institutionalized at the time and able to come to the camp for a couple of weeks or for some portion of the summer, or was that not applicable to the situation?
Well, I mean, things were happening politically all around. For example, when Geraldo Rivera did the expose on Willowbrook, that was the first time the next summer Bobby Cantor and Harvey Jabovsky came from Willowbrook. They were in the adult camp. They weren't in the teen camp. But again, people were in nursing homes or they were, at home, and there was no ADA, really effective transportation. There was no accessibility. And so these 4 weeks were the only time when not only they were out in nature, but they were having fun. They were with peers. They could talk, explore. The staff was there. It was made very clear to the staff that we were not there to have an ego and talk about, how wonderful we were for, quote unquote, sacrificing our summer to engage with this. I mean, we were told, you're there to be all about the campers, and, we don't really care how you feel about stuff, which, I have no problem with that.
What a gift it must have been for the campers. It's wonderful. Before I ask my next question of Melinda and Ben, if folks are thinking of questions along the way that they'd like to ask of Melinda and Ben, depending on the time that we have remaining after some questions that I plan to ask them, if you want to send them directly to me, Mandy Levine, just as a private message in the chat, I will receive all of those. And after I ask the questions I've already prepared, I will be more than happy to open those questions up. So as things pop up, as Melinda and Ben are talking, feel free to send me a message in chat so we can hear a few more perspectives. All right, so next question is for Ben about your footage and what happened to your footage after your summer filming at Camp Jened. And building on that same question, how did you locate the campers? How did you locate the staff after all those decades had passed?
Yeah, well, it's another one of those amazing fateful things. But just let me make one other comment about your question about revolution. because I think that when we were there, it would have been a big jump to think of campers forming a revolutionary movement. But at the same time, we felt that videotape and had the potential to be a revolutionary effect in communities and to help communities find voice and meet power with a different kind of organization. So we worked in many different communities and around that time, and doing the same kinds of things we did at Jened, and and um, and so we had a sense that the videotape was a media revolution that could create afterwards a social revolution, that it was in the process of creating social revolution as we went along, if you were willing to see revolution as a new, in a different light. So so in terms of the footage, what we were recording on in those days and the technology were half-inch reels of videotape. They look like audio tape, reels of audio tape. I'm sure people have seen that. And they came in a reel about so big, and it's about 6 inches in diameter, and you could record 20 minutes to 30 minutes on a reel. And so we, within, I would say, 4 or 5 years, it became impossible to actually play these back at all, because the equipment became obsolete, and there were no machines that could play it on. Eventually, they all broke, and on top of that, the tape had a peculiar kind of chemical reaction that it started to stick together.
Oh,
So
no.
yeah. So about 40 plus or minus years went by without our being able to just like say to each other, "Hey, Howard, how would you like to take a look at the Camp Jened footage? Wasn't that a particularly good thing that we did?" And watch it and have a good laugh and appreciation. You couldn't do that. But we had in our minds a very strong visual image that that in many of these projects, and especially Jened, that important things had happened. That the emotional memories for us were still there. So when it became possible to digitize these tapes with a new process that Bay Area Video Coalition, BAVAC, thanks to a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, made it available for us to, at a very low cost, start to digitize these tapes.
Ben, just to interrupt with a quick question, what year was that technology became
That was
available?
about 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh my goodness, so decades had passed.
Yeah, well, yeah, 40, 45 years had passed. So the technology was there, but it was just excessively expensive. It cost $400 for like 30 minutes. It wasn't anything we could do. But with this grant from the National Endowment of the Arts, we were able to start each year digitizing some. So at one point, as James and Nicole were starting to visualize their film, Jim mentioned to Nicole that there had been, he had been telling her about the camp, and but they didn't have a really good way to visualize it. And then he said, I think that there might be some videotape available, because this team came and did all kinds of stuff with us, and I remember it very well. So I think it must have taken Nicole at least a month to track us down. We were like experts at non-self-promotion. Finding people's video theater 5 years ago, you had to be a very good detective, and she is. And she found us, and we hadn't digitized that material yet. And she offered to give us the money up front to digitize it if she could have a first look at it. And as soon as she and Jim saw it, and we all saw it, it was obvious this was something special had happened, and so they bought the license to use the footage in their film. But at the same time, we didn't know if they were going to make a film. Nicole had a good reputation, but it's always a long shot. A documentary at this stage is always a long shot. So we didn't really know what would happen as a result. But yeah, that's how it, we didn't look for them, they found us.
And I would think that a lot of the evolution and revolution of various technologies probably assisted in tracking down some of the campers and staff. With the Facebook and the social media world that we live in, it might have been harder so many years ago to connect with
Yeah.
people, where we have so much access to tracking down people today. So I'm wondering how the advent of technology and social media might have helped that
I think
process
it
along.
definitely, I think it definitely did, because there are video archives that had a few bits and pieces of people's video theater materials in them that are online.
Hmm.
And but uh, yeah, so I think that definitely helped. But still, um, being able to know that people's video theater actually existed, and it was a far cry to find us, because you could find a few pieces of tape, but finding us was another task altogether. And then, it was amazing, because we always knew that eventually people would come to become interested in our footage and in what people's video theater had done, because it was revolutionary,
Mm.
and want to know more about it. And so, in a sense, I mean, we're not getting any younger, Howard and I, and we weren't, holding our breaths, but to have this happen at this time, and to have this kind of work recognized, I always wondered what these physicists thought when somebody gave them a Nobel Prize for research they did 40 or 50 years ago. I thought, well, they've done a lot of stuff since then, haven't they? Why are they giving them an award for that? But I can really see now the effort to appreciate archival footage and to use it, and to learn how to use it. For instance, not anybody could edit that footage.
Mm.
Mary Lamson and Shane Hosfeld and Alyssa, I think her name is, three of the major editors, Andy, they had some real significant challenges, because this was not film footage as it's currently shot. In those days, you could not edit very easily. And so we typically let the camera run all the time. And some of our shots were sometimes, 8, 10, 12, 15 minutes long.
Wow.
And we included camera moves because we had to keep the audio continuity. So it was very challenging for them to edit this footage and to make it, not only to edit it, but to turn it into something that was award-winning is really a great honor for us.
What did it feel like the first time, Ben, that you saw the footage after not seeing it? I'm guessing in some instances since you initially filmed that. I can only imagine what that felt like for you.
Well, it's a great question, because I've been filming since 40 or 50 years since then. I have a lot of things that I've done. But I guess the simple answer is, when I started to see it, it was like my mind had been playing the videotape to me all along.
Oh, wow.
It just seemed like it was just as I had remembered it. Not maybe in exact details, but in the spirit of it, and the look of it was all there, and the effect of it was all there. Yeah.
It is amazing how that footage can transport you back, I would think, to a time long ago. Fascinating.
But I'll tell you, the really extraordinary thing was being at Sundance with, I don't know, were there 1,200 people in that auditorium, and another 500 in adjacent auditorium, and again, another kind of very sympathetic thing that happened to this project is that it was able to screen at Sundance right before COVID. If Sundance had happened a couple of weeks later, it would have been a totally different story. So, and the response at Sundance was, and seeing it in that audience, with that kind of audience, and then being invited onto the stage with all the people from who were part of the film project, it wasn't something I really had thought I would ever do, because my kind of filmmaking is not, I'm not trying to make big films that are screened to large audiences. I tend to
The
work
next
with,
Jurassic Park, they're not reaching
no,
out to you to
no.
make that.
I'm interested in making, small changes in small
Yeah.
groups, and I think that's the thing that I've become good at, and so in small communities. So so to see that happening wasn't anything I'd ever expected, and it was just a real joy. Yeah.
I can only imagine. Thank you, Ben. A question for Melinda, switching gears a little bit, and you touched upon this a little bit with one of your past answers. Can you please speak to how Camp Jened provided a place for the campers where barriers that they typically experienced in the outside world and their sense of otherness disappeared?
Well, yes. I mean, as I said, everybody was valued. Everybody was in, the bunks were divided by gender and age, and everybody felt that they were responsible for everyone else. You were going to help people along if somebody needed some kind of help. If you had the ability to help someone, it didn't matter if you were a camper or a counselor. That was the ethos. The other thing is that the whole notion of always saying yes. How are we going to make this baseball game happen? How are we going to make this drama happen? How are we going to figure out how a particular camper is going to be able to paint or do an art project? And so there was never a sense of, well, you can't paint because your hands aren't coordinated. Well, okay, fine, put the brush in your mouth. And so all of the ways that, but also that, the campers may have had experience doing these kinds of things. And that was another real lesson for the staff, because many of the campers had dysarthrias, and you had to sit and listen and ask them to repeat themselves. And people would know if you were BSing them. I mean, if you were just nodding your head as if because they experienced that all the time in the quote unquote real world, is not being heard and people not taking the time to listen. So we had the activities that you had at any camp. We had campfires and sleep outs and arts and crafts and sports, and you took away, somebody would hit the, you'd help them hit the ball on the baseball field, and then you tip their wheelchair back, and then you'd run with them for first base. And I think that's Lionel Woodyard said, and if you were out, you're out. Nobody was sitting there going, oh, well, so-and-so's disabled, they can't be out. I mean, the whole thing was to also create expectations that people could rise to become their own best selves in that environment. And I mean, a lot of what I'm saying in retrospect, having thought about the extraordinary things that went on there. It wasn't as if everybody was, the staff was sat down and said, philosophically, this is what we're doing. But it was just osmotic. The energy that the editing, yes, was extraordinary. I mean, I was at the first time I saw the film was at the MoMA opening, and I'm sitting there with friends that had been, and two of the people in the film, the woman in the beginning who flips a finger has been my friend since I was 10 years old, and then there's another woman in there that was wearing a triangular kerchief. We met at Jened. We've been friends ever since. But to be able to say there's so and so and there's so and so, but what really comes through is the energy and the enthusiasm and the joy of making it happen every day, which isn't to say that there weren't challenges, but it really captures what the place was about. And again, it was the early 70s. So anyway.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that if I could, Amanda.
Of course.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think, you know, two things. One is when Howard is interviewing Nancy Rosenblum, and she makes that long, pretty unintelligible to us statement, and then Howard just like pauses, and you know he's been listening, and he has the intuition to ask somebody else to translate if they can.
Steve Hoffman.
And Steve translates it. And what you're seeing there is Nancy's not only speaking for herself, she's talking about privacy, and, you know, fundamental issue of privacy. She's speaking for all of them. And you can see how they're listening to each other. They've learned to listen to each other. Who else has learned to listen to Nancy in that same kind of way as those folks there? So that becomes then part of the energy that goes into the building the trust and the bonding that makes Jeanette so special. And I wanted to add another thing, which is people don't talk about it, but you know, let's face it, disabled people were sexual. And these kids were having sex. And the crab epidemic video isn't just a cute kind of odd, oh wow, you know, communicable sexual diseases in a camp for the disabled, you know, how kinky. This was like, they were experimenting, as all teenagers were, you know, with finding themselves as sexual beings. And that was not something that would have happened at the Home for Crippled Children. That I had worked previously. So this larger part of themselves that was being allowed to develop, that the counselors, people like Nancy, I don't know how you, you know, Melinda, I don't know how it was to be a counselor when you knew that everybody was, you know, going at it in any way they could. But, you know, it was eye-opening, and I think it's a big part of the film that conveys the humanity and the eroticism of these folks that has never really been looked at before, as far as I know. Yeah.
Who's the couple then that's very affectionate towards each other in the movie, that speak very openly about their sexual attraction to each other? And that was for me, a narrative, like you suggested, that I wasn't used to seeing, that I thought was just tremendously powerful,
Yeah.
and normalizing the behavior that most human beings engage in. I thought was really a very powerful part of the movie.
That was Jimmy LeBrecht. That was the director.
Yeah, that's James.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. No, that was Jimmy.
Nancy.
And Nancy D'Angelo.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was the blonde kid. That's the director.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah.
So question for both of you, and it's already 7:51, time goes by too quickly. How did both of your experiences at Camp Jened in the 1970s subsequently impact the professional careers you have had since then?
Melinda, you want to go?
Well, I think yes, I became a physician, but I think that I would emphasize again that the way I thought about practicing medicine, the way I thought about being a colleague, the way I thought about systems was strongly influenced by what happened at Jened. I mean, I guess, you know, for example, when I was first practicing in Maine, when we all think of breast cancer care now is coordinated and everybody expects it, and you go in and there are all of the different specialists, et cetera. But back back in the 90s, it wasn't that way at all. So the notion of you're looking at a system and the system is not really serving people, people are not having the access they need. So how do you think about that differently? I mean, I credit Jened and my experiences at Jened with the ability to think differently about what's in front of me and try to not think about what I might need, but really try to understand what's going on. So I think and also the notion of who's an other, because at Jened nobody was an other, and I think that that ethos is something that I always kept in mind. So I mean I think Jened was totally transforming for me.
That's terrific.
Well, I think Jened was one of many projects that we did in a 5 or 6 year period that People's Video Theater and then Survival Arts Media did, in which, using feedback, we were able to create an emotional response that was very different than what had preceded it. So the joy that I saw being released in Jened, as I said, you know, the memory of that stayed with me. And there was a period in my career where I couldn't do that kind of work, and I felt very badly about that. And then as I started to get interested in endangered languages and communities that were experiencing their language and culture being lost, I eventually started to do that same kind of work with video feedback, and found it to be very useful in situations where there had been trauma, and community trauma and individual trauma. And so I think that Jened really sort of prepared me for taking on this kind of work that we're now known internationally for doing, and in terms of actually creating a sense that it is possible to revive endangered languages and to help communities with the things that they want and need. So I would say that it was part of a process that was going on at that time, that this revolutionary medium, which stopped being, in a way, you know, video. There's nothing more mundane now. Everybody has a video camera in their phone, and yet we're still using it, and we're still doing this this kind of process to help people, help individuals find their voice, help communities find their direction, and so it was really an important piece of it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the notion that everyone has a story, and sometimes the story needs to be elicited. Sometimes you just need to slow down because they're actually telling the story and you're not listening. I think that's a crucial skill in medicine. And again, now if you look there, it's part of medical education. But when I was in medical school, the whole notion of somebody having a story and how do you really listen, and how do you not just bring your own biases to the table and impose your concept of what you think their story might be onto a reality. I mean, at Jened, that kind of ethos was occurring every day, and it's in some sense, you know, a real model for, it was, I mean, it was a pretty wild place, but it's a model for being with and you know, living where nobody, as I said, where nobody is the other. That was extraordinary.
Sounds like it was really transformative for both of you. So I'm going to skip a couple of my last questions because there's some really great ones coming in through the chat box to me. One is a very quick question, which is where did the camp name come from? Was it the name of the founder of the camp?
It's in the story. I think it's in the outtakes. Is it? I mean, we always thought it was Jenny and Ed who had founded the camp, but it's something like that. It's not,
Yeah.
you know, it's not. It's something like that.
That's
Yeah.
something that was created.
Yeah.
Mishmashed together. Got it.
Yeah.
Here's another question for, and I think Melinda, you would probably be the best one to answer this particular question. As a person with a disability who requires the help of caregivers each morning and night, I was wondering if any of the counselors had a difficult time with the scope of care they needed to provide to campers, and did any of the counselors experience burnout? And actually, the third question, did any of them leave because it was not quite what they expected the experience to be? It's a great question.
I would say, and I mean, again, with 6 years experience there, and you know, the last 2 in a supervisory capacity, I was responsible for training counselors, and I would say very, very few people upped and left because of any challenges. Yes, there were absolutely people who required much more care than other people. I think it was important, and in terms of your question about burnout, when I was a supervisor of adult camp, I would wake up first day of a new camper group. I would make sure that I was the first one in the bunk, and I would choose the person who is the most challenging to take care of, and make sure that she was the first one in at the breakfast table to model for the other counselors. But I would also make sure, and you know, in the bunks, keeping an eye on things, that if there was a counselor who would cheerily always go up to help the person who is the least challenging to care for, that I would make sure, as in a supervisory capacity, that everybody was getting the experience of interacting with everybody, and that developed people's skill sets, comfort levels. I mean, yes, I mean, absolutely right. Here you have 15, 16, 17-year-olds with no professional training, suddenly in a situation where they're giving the most intimate care. But again, it worked. It worked.
Ben and Melinda, you couldn't do that today. No. Can you stick around for one last question?
Sure.
We should have booked this time for longer. I'll try not to push my luck with you. Last question. Did any of the camp counselors that you are aware of have disabilities themselves? And is there any chance that the camp will be revived someday?
Well, the answer to that is absolutely yes. And that was another thing. You know, you'd walk around camp, and I mean, yes, if somebody was profoundly intellectually disabled, they likely weren't a counselor. But if somebody was intellectually sound, then there was no reason to believe that just because they were disabled, they weren't staff. So there were plenty of campers who graduated from teen camp, aged out of teen camp, and instead of going to adult camp, became counselors.
That's
Judy Human was a counselor. She was, I mean, she was, you know, she said at one point, she goes, I got to go in and give a couple of showers. So Mike Tannenbaum, I mean, in the first opening scene, there were these 2 male friends that are talking about, you know, oh, this is a great place or whatever. And the bigger one, Mike Tannenbaum, became a counselor. The guy in the wheelchair is the guy I was referring to, John Maslin, who had the kinds of muscular dystrophy where, you know, he died in his early 20s. But yes, campers went on to become counselors, or disabled people who were never campers applied and became counselors. Yeah, there was no barrier in that regard.
Terrific.
Amanda, I'd like to ask Melinda a question about Larry, the camp director. You obviously must have known him quite well, having worked there such a long time. And, you know, we did several projects with him, and he invited us to come and show video and so on after the time at that first year at Jened. But, you know, as I look back at the footage in the film and in the film itself, I wonder, was he just some kind of genius leader? Was it just serendipity, or was it intentional that he let it play out the way it did? Or what do we need to know about Larry and his and how he managed to let what might seem like chaos to some people, but was obviously a pretty disciplined group. How did he pull that off?
Well, I think that your notion of discipline plus chaos is correct. Larry's background was in education. He unfortunately died a few years ago. I don't know if you know that, but the notion of spontaneity and letting things happen, and that, I mean, it was right after Woodstock. It was there was an attitude. I mean, excuse me. I mean, later at night, I mean, there were a lot of drugs involved. I mean, it was, you know, we were all, you know, when we weren't working, we were all living as
you were.
Teens and 20s who were children of the 70s. But when I think you point out very well the intersection of discipline, things that never broke down were, you know, the rules of how you handle a camper in the swimming pool, things which other things might have been an activity that was supposed to start out as drama, but then because of jokes that people were telling or something, it morphed completely into something else. So there was that freedom to have things happen. But yes, there was discipline. I mean, there's another guy in there, Dennis Scambaluri. He doesn't get profiled. I will say, you know, also it was a place where you could be gay. There were many people in the supervisory capacity and counselors who were gay, and that was not a time where you know, it was obviously easy to do that in the world.
That's very interesting. That would be an interesting theme to follow up, you know, in somebody's research. Thank you.
I mean, there are several people there I can tell you that died of AIDS. I mean, it was an intersection of the times, and then of course all the stories of the group of counselors who came up from Alabama, Lionel Woodyard, you know, who's featured. You know, race wasn't the other. Sexuality wasn't the other. Disability wasn't the other. I mean, it was certainly the first time, you know, as a 15-year-old, I had no exposure to that kind of, that there were different people in the world. But at Jened, people found a home and made it work, again, with the priority being the campers, 100%.
Well, I am very reluctantly being cognizant of the time. If I could go back in time, I would have asked you for 2 hours because I suspect everyone would love to continue talking with you. But I just want to say on behalf of the Portland Disability Advisory Committee and Disability Rights Maine and the Maine Jewish Film Festival, Ben and Melinda, I'm so incredibly grateful for you sharing your experiences and your really remarkable stories with us tonight. You're just both really terrific human beings doing amazing work, and I'm just really grateful you carved out time to meet with all of us. And we have folks from all over the country who are joining us tonight, which is really exciting. So I think we've got some Californians participating. So lots of thank yous being shouted out, but I'm so grateful, and I suspect everyone else is too. And congratulations for all of the success of the documentary. It's really quite remarkable. I've said remarkable about 10 times tonight, but I really do mean it when I say it.
It's my pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Right.
I love
Thank
Jeanette.
you.
Talk about the film and about Jeanette and to meet Melinda.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Actually, I heard about you from Bill McFarland.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I went on to do a lot of work in public health, and Bill is a leader in mental health, and I did a number of things with him, and he and I are very old friends. We went to college together.
No,
So,
he told me about you, and I said, Mandy, track him down.
Oh, there you go.
So did you make up your last name just to connect with me? No. Well, thank you. Maybe we'll be able to do this in non-COVID days in person someday. So that would
Thank
be
you for organizing that.
my pleasure. It was truly a pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you,
all
Amanda,
so much.
for the sponsoring organizations for the opportunity.
Very
Okay.
much. Thank you, everyone. All the best to everyone, and stay safe.
Likewise.
All right. Good night. Thank you, Melinda and Ben.